Chapter 126. The council continues. One player removed from the board, Ned said quietly. He tossed the stained linen cloth onto the polished wood. It landed with a soft, damp slap near the crushed, bloody remnants of Petyr Baelish's fingers. No one spoke. The great lords of Westeros, men who commanded tens of thousands of swords, sat perfectly rigid in their chairs. The sudden, brutal dismemberment of the Master of Coin had completely shattered the illusion of safety within the council. They realized, with cold clarity, that Eddard Stark was not bound by the polite traditions of court. He was acting as a judge, jury, and executioner, and the king was letting him do it. Ned picks up a glass goblet. He did not pour the clear northern vodka this time. He poured a small measure of Dornish red, holding the goblet loosely in his hand. He began to pace again. The sound of his heavy boots striking the stone floor was the only noise in the cavernous room. Every eye tracked him. Mace Tyrell was sweating profusely, dabbing his brow with a silk handkerchief. Hoster Tully breathed shallowly, clutching his chest. Olenna Tyrell watched the wolf with a rapt, morbid fascination, her sharp mind watching every step he took. The men of the South pride themselves on their histories, Ned began, his voice calm, ringing with the resonant, heavy authority of a maester lecturing a hall of novices. You read the tomes of the Citadel. You memorize the lineages of Undul kings and Rhoynish princes. You measure power in the number of heavy horse you can field, the amount of gold in your treasury, and the amount of grain in your silos. Ned walked slowly behind Stannis Baratheon. The master of ships stared straight ahead, his jaw locked tight, refusing to flinch as the Warden of the North passed his chair. But you have forgotten the true history of this world, Ned continued. You treat the old tales as fables. You view magic as cheap parlor tricks performed by mummer troops in the free cities. You forgot that magic is not a trick. It is a force of nature, and it is tied intrinsically to blood. Ned paused behind the chair of Jon Arryn. The hand of the king looked thoroughly broken, still reeling from the absolute betrayal of the man he had treated like a son. Blood is power, Ned stated softly. The blood of the first men carries the magic of the earth and the trees. It allows the skin changers to walk in the minds of beasts, and the greenseers to look through the eyes of the weirwoods. Ned looked toward the Vale delegation. The Royces still wear the bronze runes of their ancestors, wards that once held true, undeniable power against the dark. Lord Yohn Royce unconsciously touched his bronze breastplate, a deep frown settling on his weathered face. The Storm Kings of House Durrandon carried the magic of the wind and sea, building a keep that defies the wrath of the gods, Ned continued, pacing slowly. House Gardner possessed the Green Hand, the ancient ability to coax life and bloom from barren soil, and House Dane traces a lineage forged from a fallen star, carrying a deep, ancient connection to the dawn. Ned's boots thudded a steady, relentless rhythm. The blood of the Rhoynar carried the magic of the water, and the blood of old Valyria carried the magic of fire. It allowed the Targaryens and the Valerians to tame dragons, bind stone with flame, and master the seas. The doom shattered the freehold, but the bloodlines survived. Ned approached the far end of the long table. He walked past Grand Maester Pycelle, who was trembling so violently his heavy chain of office rattled softly against his chest. Magic did not leave this world, Ned declared, his gray eyes sweeping across the room. It merely retreated to the shadows, waiting for men to forget. He stopped behind the chair of Lord Varys. The Master of Whisperers sat perfectly still. His soft, powdered hands were folded neatly on the table before him. He smelled of cloying rosewater and lavender. Varys had spent his entire life mastering the art of remaining unnoticed, of being a harmless, useful fixture in the background of powerful men. But as Eddard Stark stopped directly behind him, Varys felt a sudden primal spike of absolute terror. He forced his breathing to remain slow and even. He did not turn his head. He believes he hears every whisper in the Seven Kingdoms, Ned said quietly, standing right behind the eunuch. He thinks his little birds see all, but a spider only feels the vibrations that touch its own web. It is entirely blind to the boot descending from above. A single bead of cold sweat formed on Varys's powdered brow. When the dragons fell, the loyalists died with them or fled across the sea, Ned continued, his voice dropping to a cold edge. Yet the Master of Whisperers remained. You all believed it was because he was useful, or because a eunuch holds no true loyalty. You never realized he stayed because his work was not yet finished. He did not stay to serve the stag. He stayed to ensure the throne remained vulnerable. King Robert's brow furrowed, his blue eyes narrowing as he stared hard at the spider. "He tells you he serves the realm," Ned told the gathered lords. "He whispers that he acts only for the good of the children and the peace of the small folk. It is the greatest lie ever told in this keep. He does not care if the 7 kingdoms burn to ash, so long as the ashes can be molded into the shape of his choosing." Ned looked toward the empty chair where Baelish had sat. Men like Peter Baelish measure their success in stolen gold and immediate titles. They are impatient thieves. But those who carry the blood of fallen empires do not play for coppers. They measure their plots in decades. They will wait in the dark for 20 years, smiling at the men they intend to destroy. Ned looked out over the table. "You all remember the Mad King. You remember how Aerys saw enemies in every shadow and treason in every whisper. But you never stopped to ask who was standing behind the throne, painting those shadows on the walls." Jon Arryn's breath caught in his throat, the horrific realization dawning on him. Jon Arryn's breath caught in his throat, the horrific realization dawning on him. When his true family realized they could no longer defeat the Targaryens on the open field of battle, they decided to defeat them at court, Ned revealed, the absolute truth settling heavily over the room. He fed a madman his fears, ensuring the realm would bleed. Ned did not draw a blade. He did not raise his voice. With sudden, brutal speed, Ned reached down. He grabbed back of Varys' head. Then he drove Varys' face straight down into the heavy oak table. The impact was severe. A sickening crack echoed through the room as Varys' nose shattered against the wood. The eunuch let out a muffled, strangled cry of pain, his hands flying up to try and push himself away. But Ned's grip was like an iron vice. The Lord of Winterfell held Varys' face pinned firmly against the table, completely immobilizing him. The lords in the room jumped, a fresh wave of shock rolling over the council. "Lord Stark!" Jon Arryn gasped, standing up from his chair, his eyes wide. Tywin Lannister's pale green eyes narrowed into slits. He looked at the bleeding, pinned eunuch, then back to the Warden of the North, his mind racing to calculate the meaning behind this sudden assault. King Robert did not shout. He did not ask for an explanation. He had given his word in the Solar that the room belonged to the wolf, and he intended to keep it. Robert raised a heavy hand, waving Jon Arryn back into his seat, and leaned forward in his chair, his thick brow furrowing as he waited for Ned to speak. Ned kept his heavy hand pressed firmly against the back of Varys' head. Blood was already beginning to pool beneath the eunuch's face, staining the polished oak wood. "Every one of you knows that Varys is a eunuch," Ned said, addressing the shocked council, his voice remaining perfectly composed and devoid of anger. "But did he tell anyone how he became one?" Ned looked around the long table. He met the eyes of the great lords, the hand of the king, and the king himself. No one spoke. No one knew the truth of the spider's origins. "You see, a warlock had cut his genitals and fed it to the fire, and a warlock values magical blood a lot, as it will help them in casting magic," Ned explained to the silent room. "You do not perform a costly, dangerous blood magic ritual using the parts of a common street beggar. Our Varys here has magic in his blood." Ned looked out over the faces of his peers. "Can anyone guess which bloodline?" He waited for a moment. Prince Oberyn Martell leaned forward, his dark eyes sharp, but even the Red Viper remained silent, letting the wolf finish his trap. Seeing no answer, Ned tightened his grip on Varys', forcing the eunuch to remain still as he struggled weakly against the wood. "He has the blood of old Valyria," Ned revealed, his voice echoing off the stone walls. "He has the blood of House Targaryen, or, if I should use the correct term, House Blackfyre." The silence in the small council chamber was absolute. It was a suffocating, heavy quiet, as if the air had been sucked from the room. At the door, Ser Barristan Selmy went entirely pale. The legendary Lord Commander of the Kingsguard stepped forward, his hand dropping instinctively to the hilt of his sword. He stared at the bleeding eunuch with a mixture of shock and bitter regret. "I slew Meleys the Monstrous on the stepstones," Barristan murmured, his voice thick with shame. "I watched the line end in the mud. I thought the threat was extinguished, only to let the true serpent slip right past me into the king's own halls." King Robert Baratheon's face drained of color, before immediately flooding with a deep, violent shade of crimson. The Baratheon king had fought a grueling, bloody rebellion against Blood of Dragon. He had swung his warhammer on the trident to end their dynasty permanently. To hear that a descendant of the Blackfire pretenders had been sitting at his own council table, whispering in his ear and eating his bread for 15 years, was an insult that transcended fury. A Blackfire? Robert growled, his voice a low, terrifying rumble that promised absolute slaughter. He stared at the pinned eunuch, his hands gripping the armrests of his chair so tightly the wood groaned. "You put a bloody dragon on my council, John?" John Arryn looked utterly devastated. The hand of the king sank back into his chair, looking physically ill. "Your Grace, I did not know. He served your predecessor. I thought his loyalties were to the realm." "His loyalties are to his own blood," Ned stated coldly. Ned looked down at the spider. Varys was no longer struggling. The Master of Whisperers lay perfectly still against the wood, breathing heavily through his mouth as blood ran from his shattered nose. The grand deception he had maintained for decades had been torn away in a matter of seconds. "While you thought he was serving the Iron Throne, he has been quietly plotting its downfall," Ned told the gathered lords. Tywin Lannister leaned forward slightly, his sharp mind demanding the full picture. "To what end, Lord Stark?" The line of House Blackfire was extinguished on the stepstones. "The spider is a eunuch. He has no heirs." "The male line was extinguished," Ned agreed, looking directly at the Lord of Casterly Rock. "But the female line survived. Varys has a sister. Her name was Sarah. She married a wealthy magister in Pentos named Illyrio Mopatis. Before the grayscale took her, she gave him a son." Ned raised his head, ensuring every lord in the room heard the full scope of the treason. "His name is Aegon Blackfire," Ned revealed. "Varys and Illyrio have spent the last 15 years hiding the boy in Essos. They have educated him, trained him in arms, and groomed him to be the perfect king. And they have hired the Golden Company to serve as his vanguard." Mace Tyrell gasped loudly. "The Golden Company? 10,000 sellswords. 10,000 of the finest, most disciplined soldiers in the world, supported by heavy horse and war elephants," Ned corrected. "They are sitting in the disputed lands right now, waiting for the spider's signal to cross the narrow sea and claim the Iron Throne." Stannis Baratheon's jaw ground audibly. The Master of Ships stared at Varys with pure loathing. Treason. Calculated, absolute treason. He planned to invite an invading army to our shores. "An invading army cannot conquer a united Westeros," Ned said, pacing slightly while keeping Varys pinned with one hand. "Even the Golden Company would shatter against the combined might of the Baratheons, the Lannisters, and the North." Varys knew this. Ned looked at King Robert. "That is why he has been poisoning the realm from within," Ned explained softly. "Varys did not want to fight a united kingdom. He wanted us to fight ourselves. He has been carefully placing whispers, feeding paranoia, and creating divisions between the great houses. He wanted the stags, the lions, and the wolves to bleed each other dry in a massive civil war." Tywin Lannister's pale eyes went completely cold. The Lord of the Westerlands realized exactly what his house had been intended for. They were meant to be meat for the slaughter. Varys had intended to use the Lannister armies to exhaust the Baratheons and the Starks, leaving Casterly Rock bankrupt and bleeding. "He meant to burn our fields and empty our armories," Tywin deduced, his voice a lethal whisper. "He meant to leave the realm starving and broken. And when the lords of Westeros were too exhausted to lift their swords, and the small folk were begging for an end to the madness," Ned finished the thought, "Aegon Blackfire would cross the narrow sea. He would not land as a conqueror. Varys intended for him to arrive as a savior, bringing fresh troops and Essosi grain to a starving continent." The absolute silence returned to the room. The sheer scale of the spider's grand design was staggering. Peter Baelish had stolen gold to buy his own way up the ladder, a petty thief with delusions of grandeur. But Varys had attempted to bring about the downfall of the entire realm simply to put his nephew on a throne of ashes. Robert Baratheon stood up from his chair. The king walked slowly around the heavy oak table, his boots echoing ominously. He stopped directly beside Ned, looking down at the bleeding eunuch. "You sat at my table," Robert growled, his voice vibrating with a rage so profound it seemed to pull the heat from the room. "You drank my wine. You smiled at me, and all the while, you were plotting to feed my kingdom to the crows just so your sister's bastard could steal my crown." Robert turned furiously toward his Kingsguard. "Send ravens to every port. I want knives in Pentos. I want assassins in the disputed lands. Find this Illyrio Mopatis and this Blackfire whelp and bring me their heads." No, Ned stated, his voice cutting through the king's wrath like a falling axe. Robert wheeled back, his blue eyes blazing. You would spare them? I would not waste our strength chasing ghosts across the sea, Ned countered coldly. The Golden Company is a distraction. Petty squabble for an iron chair. We cannot afford to empty your treasury hiring assassins. Nor can we send ships to Essos, when an army of dead men is marching on the wall. Let the boy sit in the dust. The true war is in the snow. Robert stared at his friend, his breathing heavy, before his jaw slowly unclenched. He turned his furious gaze back to the ruined master of whisperers. Let me kill him, Ned, Robert commanded, reaching down with a massive heavy hand. Ned did not release his grip on Varys. He met the king's gaze calmly. His death belongs to the crown, Robert, Ned agreed quietly. But a swift death in this room is too merciful for a man who intended to drown the realm in blood. He must face the justice of the kingdom he tried to destroy. Ned looked up at the Kingsguard knights standing near the doors. Take him, Ned ordered. The two knights marched forward. Ned finally released his grip on the back of Varys's head. The knights grabbed the eunuch by the arms, hauling him roughly to his feet. Varys's face was a ruined, bloody mess, his nose crushed and his powdered skin stained dark crimson. For the first time since the blow, Varys spoke. He coughed, spitting a mouthful of blood onto the polished stone floor. He did not look at Ned. He looked directly at King Robert. You may take my head, your grace, Varys whispered, his voice a wet, ragged hiss that sent a chill through the hall. But the storm is already moving. You roar from a throne of rusted swords, blind to the fact that your kingdom was already dead long before the wolf arrived to tell you. Get him out of my sight, Robert roared, his face flushed with fury. Throw him in the black cells. Chain him to the wall. The Kingsguard dragged the bleeding spider out of the chamber, his soft slippers dragging across the stone. The heavy oak doors slammed shut. Ned Stark reached down, picked up his cloth, and wiped the fresh blood from the table. He tossed the cloth aside, turning back to the pale, stunned faces of the lords of Westeros. The spider follows the mockingbird, Ned said quietly. Chapter 127, The Forged Chain. The spider follows the mockingbird, Ned said quietly. He did not immediately return to his place beside the king. Instead, the Warden of the North resumed his slow, deliberate pacing around the massive oak table. The heavy thud of his boots against the stone floor was the only sound in the cavernous room. The great lords of the realm sat in absolute, paralyzed silence. In less than half an hour, Eddard Stark had systematically and brutally dismantled two of the most powerful figures in the capital. The illusion of safety had been completely shattered. They watched the wolf circle the table, their minds racing with cold dread, wondering whose sins would be dragged into the light next. Tywin Lannister sat with rigid, immaculate posture, his pale green eyes tracking Ned's every movement. The Lord of Casterly Rock betrayed no outward fear, but his mind was calculating the catastrophic shift in the balance of power. Olenna Tyrell sat perfectly still, her sharp eyes narrowed, deeply grateful that Highgarden had chosen to remain neutral during the crusade at the Neck. We have spoken of the great Game of Thrones, and the men who play it with stolen gold. Ned began, his voice calm, ringing with the heavy resonance of a seasoned commander addressing his war council. We have spoken of ancient bloodlines and the Shadowbinders across the sea who seek to use them to burn our shores. Ned walked past the rigid form of Stannis Baratheon, rounding the corner of the table near the Vale delegation. But there is another pillar of power in this realm, Ned continued. A quieter pillar, one that does not wield swords or command armies. Ned paused briefly behind Hoster Tully, his gray eyes sweeping over the quiet room. Far to the south in Old Town sits the Citadel, Ned said, adopting the same lecturing tone he had used to expose the Master of Whisperers. It is a place of scholars and learned men. Boys from across the continent travel there to study the mysteries of the world. When they earn their links, they surrender their family names. They forge heavy chains of metal around their necks. Iron for war, gold for money, silver for healing, black iron for ravenry. Prince Oberyn Martell leaned back in his chair, his dark eyes glittering with intense, focused curiosity. He had forged several links of a maester's chain himself in his youth before growing bored of the Citadel's rigid dogma. He knew exactly where the Lord of Winterfell was aiming his spear. They swear solemn vows, Ned continued, pacing slowly behind the chairs of the Reach delegation. Mace Tyrell visibly stiffened as the shadow of the wolf passed over him. They swear to hold no lands, to take no wives, and to serve the realm, regardless of who sits upon the throne or holds the castle they are assigned to. Ned stopped pacing for a moment, looking across the table. They embed themselves in every great keep and every minor holdfast in the 7 kingdoms, Ned stated, his voice dropping to a low, cold edge. They are the ones who read your sealed missives. They are the ones who write your replies. They tend to your sick, they record your histories, and they manage your ravens. We trust them completely because they wear gray robes and speak in soft, scholarly tones. They hold the entire flow of information in their hands. Ned resumed his walk, his boots carrying him toward the foot of the massive oak table. It is a noble calling, Ned acknowledged quietly. But vows are merely wind when a man forgets his true purpose. There are people in this room who work for the king, who wear the heavy chains of servitude, but who do not have true allegiance to the king. Ned's gray eyes hardened into chips of flint. And I can smell them from a mile away. Ned stopped his pacing. He stood directly behind the chair of Grand Maester Pycelle. The old man sat hunched over the table. Pycelle was frail, his bald head liver-spotted, his long white beard trembling slightly against the heavy, ornate chain of office draped across his chest. He had watched the Warden of the North crush Petyr Baelish's fingers to dust and shatter Lord Varys's face against the wood. The sheer, suffocating terror radiating from the old man was palpable. Ned slowly raised his arm. He placed his hand squarely onto Pycelle's stooped shoulder. Pycelle flinches violently, a sharp, terrified gasp escaping his dry lips. The sudden, jerky movement caused the heavy metal links of his maester's chain to rattle loudly in the dead silence of the small council chamber. "Say, Pycelle?" Ned asked softly, the unnatural calmness of his voice contrasting horribly with the violence the room had just witnessed. "Whose orders do you follow?" Pycelle swallowed hard, his rheumy eyes darting desperately toward the head of the table. My lord," the old man stammered, his voice reedy and weak, cracking under the immense pressure of Ned's grip. "I am bound to the king. I serve the realm, as my sacred vows dictate." Ned gave a slow, measured nod, keeping his heavy hand firmly anchored on the old man's shoulder. "And before Robert took the Iron Throne, whom did you have allegiance to?" It was the Mad King Aerys Targaryen," Pycelle answered, sweating profusely under the heavy robes. "I served him faithfully." "Indeed," Ned murmured. And when the rebel army approached the capital, and Lord Tywin Lannister's host arrived at the gates of King's Landing, who suggested to the Mad King that the gates be opened to allow the Lannister army to enter, the room went absolutely still. Tywin Lannister's pale green eyes locked instantly onto Ned Stark. Jaime Lannister, sitting behind his father's chair, crossed his arms tightly, the memory of the blood, ash, and madness of that day rushing back to him with vivid clarity. Prince Oberyn Martell's faint smile vanished entirely, replaced by a look of cold, unadulterated hatred as he stared at the back of the Grand Maester's head. Dorne remembered the sack of King's Landing intimately. Pycelle trembled so violently his entire chair shook. It was me, my lord." "Why?" Ned asked simply. "I genuinely believed that Lord Lannister came to fight for King Aerys," Pycelle stammered, frantically reciting the official lie he had maintained for 15 long years to save his own skin. He had been the king's hand for many years. He was a loyal servant. I believed he came to save the city from the rebels. "So it was a terrible advice," Ned stated flatly. "Yes," Pycelle agreed quickly, eager to appease the wolf and agree to incompetence rather than treason. "Yes, my lord. I should have thought of the suggestion more carefully. It was a grave miscalculation on my part. A tragedy. And yet," Ned continued, his fingers tightening slightly on Pycelle's shoulder, "even after your terrible advice resulted in the brutal sack of the capital and the slaughter of the royal family, you still serve under Robert's counsel. How does a man who gave such ruinous counsel retain his seat beside the king?" Pycelle looked pleadingly toward Jon Arryn, desperately seeking the protection of the man who had kept him employed. "We are not bound to family names, Lord Stark. We are bound to the seat. The realm needed continuity after the war. The Citadel demands stability. Lord Arryn knew that, and he was gracious enough to have me continue in my position to help guide the new king in the ways of governance." Jon Arryn closed his eyes, a deep shade of gray settling over his aged features. The hand of the king looked down at his own hands, feeling the crushing weight of his monumental naivety. He had spent 15 years trying to forge a lasting peace, and in doing so, he had pardoned a thief, a Blackfire loyalist, and a sycophant, seating them all at the king's right hand. Which worked well for you, I see, Ned noted, his voice taking on a sharper, colder edge that made the hairs on the back of Pycelle's neck stand up, telling about what all was discussed in regular small council meetings directly to the queen. The accusation hung in the air like a drawn blade. King Robert Baratheon's heavy head snapped toward Pycelle, his blue eyes narrowing into dangerous, violent slits. The king despised the political maneuvering of his wife's family, and to learn that his own supposedly neutral Grand Maester had been feeding his private council decisions directly to Casterly Rock's greatest asset enraged him. Tywin Lannister did not react physically, but his brilliant mind instantly registered the absolute, devastating dismantling of his primary informant in the capital. Eddard Stark was methodically burning Tywin's shadow influence to the ground without ever laying a finger on a Lannister. The queen is worried about the realm, my lord, Pycelle sputtered, his face turning a blotchy, uneven red as he frantically tried to defend his treason as familial concern. She is the mother to the royal children. It is only natural she wishes to be informed of the council's decisions for the safety of her children. Of course, Ned replied, his tone dripping with cold, mocking dismissal. Ned removed his heavy hand from Pycelle's shoulder and took a slow step back, bringing himself directly into the Grand Maester's field of vision. Then what about having sex with young serving girls? Ned asked, his voice cutting through the quiet room like a physical blow. Pycelle's mouth opened and closed like a landed trout. His frail, spotted hands shook violently against the polished oak table. The color drained entirely from his face, leaving him a ghastly shade of pale gray. My lord, Pycelle sputtered, his jowls shaking indignantly. I do not know what you are talking about. I am a sworn brother of the Citadel. My vows of celibacy are sacred. Ned stepped closer, leaning down slightly so his face was mere inches from the sweating, terrified Grand Maester. Do not dare deny it, Ned commanded, his voice dropping to a low, lethal whisper that promised absolute destruction. Just accept it. I can provide the proof if you want. But once I provide the evidence to this room, you will wish you were dead, you gray rat. Pycelle stared into the cold, unyielding gray eyes of the Warden of the North. His mind raced in a state of absolute, suffocating panic. The Lord of Winterfell had known the exact, impossible details of Petyr Baelish's hidden vault and buried murders. He had known the deep, dark blood magic that had forged Lord Varys in a foreign city decades ago. These were secrets buried beneath mountains of gold and oceans of water, hidden from the greatest spies in the world. If the wolf knew those impossibilities, finding a few terrified serving girls who slipped into the Grand Maester's private chambers in the dead of night would be effortless. Eddard Stark did not even need a network of spies. He seemed to possess some terrifying, omniscient sight that peered directly through stone walls. And presenting the proof would be terribly simple. Lord Stark just had to drag the girls into the Great Hall and present them to the king. The moment they spoke, Pycelle's sacred vows would be irrevocably broken. He would be stripped of his heavy chain, disgraced before the Citadel in Old Town, and likely executed by a furious King Robert for making a mockery of his position. The resistance drained out of Pycelle entirely, his fragile facade of scholarly dignity collapsing into dust. His shoulders slumped, the heavy chain of office clinking softly against the table as he collapsed into a pathetic, sobbing heap. He turned away from Ned's freezing gaze, looking desperately toward the head of the table. He slid out of his heavy wooden chair, dropping heavily to his bony knees on the hard stone floor. "Mercy, your grace," Pycelle begged, tears streaming down his wrinkled cheeks, his spotted hands clasped together toward Robert Baratheon. "I am an old, weak man. The nights in the Red Keep are so terribly cold, and the flesh is frail. I only sought a little warmth in the dark. I never meant any treason against the crown. Have mercy on an old servant of the realm." King Robert Baratheon stared down at the weeping, pathetic old man groveling on the stones. The king's face was twisted in pure, unadulterated disgust. To learn that his private, royal secrets were being sold to his wife by a man who couldn't even keep his basic, sacred vows turned his stomach. The corruption of his counsel was absolute. "You disgusting old hypocrite," Robert growled, his lip curling with revulsion. Robert did not hesitate. He looked past the weeping maester toward the two heavily armored Kingsguard knights stationed at the heavy oak doors. "Take this pathetic gray sack of robes to the cells," Robert roared, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. "Throw him in the dark with the other traitors." The two armored knights marched forward with disciplined precision. They grabbed the weeping Grand Maester by his thin arms, hauling his frail body off the stone floor without a shred of gentleness. "Please, your grace, Lord Aaron, speak for me," Pycelle wailed, his heavy boots dragging uselessly against the polished marble as the knights hauled him backward toward the exit. "I served the realm. I served the citadel." Jon Arryn did not look at him. The hand of the king simply closed his eyes, turning his weary face away from the disgrace, entirely unwilling to offer protection to the man who had spied on him for 15 years. The Kingsguard dragged Pycelle out of the chamber, his pitiful, ragged cries echoing down the stone corridor until the heavy oak doors were slammed shut once more, the iron bolts dropping into place with a definitive clack. Silence returned to the small council chambers, heavier and more oppressive than before. Ned Stark stood quietly near the end of the long table. He looked at the empty wooden chair where the Grand Maester had sat just moments before, his expression devoid of triumph. "The gray rat follows the spider," Ned said quietly. Chapter 128, The Board Reset. "The gray rat follows the spider," Ned said quietly. He resumed his pacing. He turned his back on the empty chair where the Grand Maester had sat just moments before. The physical threat of violence had left the room, but the cold reality of the new order remained. The floor was stained with blood, and the greatest spies and manipulators in the capital had been dismantled in the span of an hour. "The schemers have been removed from the board," Ned announced, his voice carrying a calm, unyielding finality that settled over the silent room. "Now we can finally prepare for the long night." He began to make his way back to the head of the heavy oak table, stepping toward his designated seat to the immediate left of King Robert. The great lords of Westeros watched him, their minds still reeling from the sudden, absolute execution of Northern justice. But before taking his seat, Ned stopped. He turned his head, his cold gray eyes locking directly onto the Lord of the Iron Islands. Balon Greyjoy sat with his arms crossed, his weathered face set in a hard scowl. "And Lord Greyjoy," Ned said, his voice dropping to a lethal, quiet pitch that cut effortlessly through the silence of the chamber. "If you think you can sit safe in your island castle until the battle against the dead is over, if you believe you can simply wait out the storm and then carve out a kingdom of your own by defeating what more of the living is left." Balon's breath caught in his throat. His arms tightened against his chest. "Do not worry about it," Ned continued, his eyes devoid of any warmth. "Because if you choose to abandon the realm in its darkest hour, I swear to you by the old gods, as soon as the war against the dead is over, the Krakens will be the very next in line whose blood will flow into the sea." The room went completely still. All of them turned their head to the Lord of the Iron Islands. Balon Greyjoy grew noticeably pale beneath his weathered, salt-stained skin. The Lord of Pike realized with terrifying clarity that the Warden of the North was not guessing. Eddard Stark knew his exact plans. He knew the silent treason brewing in Balon's mind before the Lord of the Isles had even given the order to his captains. The absolute certainty in Ned's voice promised nothing short of annihilation. Slowly, reluctantly, the pride of the Iron Islands broke against the unyielding ice of the north. Balon gave a single, stiff nod of submission. Across the table, Prince Oberyn Martell leaned back in his chair and offered a dark, thoroughly amused smirk. He despised the Ironborn's arrogant raiding culture, and watching their lord get completely neutered with a single sentence was highly entertaining. A few seats down, Jaime Lannister mirrored the expression. He crossed his arms, a faint, cynical smirk playing on his lips as he watched the old squid realize his reaving days were permanently over. Having delivered the final warning, Ned pulled out his heavy wooden chair and finally took his seat to the king's left. He rested his forearms on the polished oak table, surveying the gathered lords. 3 seats on the small council have just opened up," Ned stated pragmatically, wasting no time on ceremony. "And they are waiting for new appointments. The crown cannot function in a time of war without a complete council." Ned turned his attention to the hand of the king. Jon Arryn sat heavily in his chair, still looking pale and thoroughly exhausted by the betrayals of his former protégés. "Jon," Ned said, his tone respectful but firm, "send a raven to the citadel. Inform them that the Iron Throne requires a new Grand Maester. Tell the Archmasters to send Maester Marwyn, and do not accept anyone other than him. Jon Arryn blinked, pulled from his grief by the specific, unusual demand. Marwyn? Ned, he is known as Marwyn the Mage. He is highly unorthodox. The Citadel often frowns upon his practices. Which is exactly why we need him, Ned countered smoothly. The realm is no longer fighting a conventional war against men. We are facing an enemy of ice and old magic. Marwyn has been researching the higher mysteries and ancient magic for a long time. He is as good a scholar as Pycelle, but he will not spend his days writing polite letters to noble houses and hiding behind traditions. We need a man who understands what is coming from the deep woods. Jon Arryn considered the logic. It was undeniable. He gave a slow, confirming nod. I will send the letter to the Citadel. Marwyn shall be summoned. As for the Master of Whisperers, Ned continued, shifting his gaze across the table, I propose Lord Doran Martell. The suggestion sent a ripple of surprise through the room. Dorne and the Iron Throne are not on good terms since the end of the rebellion. To invite the ruling Prince of Dorne to sit on the King's Inner Council was a massive political shift. Tywin Lannister's pale green eyes narrowed slightly, his sharp mind instantly calculating the implications of bringing a Martell into the capital's power structure. Prince Doran suffers from a severe affliction of the joints, Ned noted, preempting the obvious logistical problem. Since he cannot comfortably travel or reside in the capital, his brother, Prince Oberyn Martell, will serve as his proxy and represent House Martell on the small council. Oberyn's smirk widened into a genuine, dangerous smile. I assure you, Lord Stark, the Vipers of the Sands hear just as many whispers as the spiders of the East. Dorne accepts the honor. Robert Baratheon, leaning heavily on the table, barely blinked. He had already promised Ned full control of the room, and he trusted his friend's judgment entirely. Done, Robert rumbled, giving a heavy nod. The Martells have the seat. Ned did not pause for breath. He immediately turned his attention to the Reach delegation. For the Master of Coin, Ned announced, his voice echoing in the quiet chamber. I propose Lord Mace Tyrell. Mace Tyrell immediately sat straight in his seat. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. He stared at Ned in absolute shock. As the Lord Paramount of the Reach, Mace commanded the largest army and the greatest food stores in Westeros, but he had never been invited to sit on the small council. He had assumed because of his previous allegiance to Targaryens, yet here was the wolf, handing him the keys to the royal treasury. Mace looked completely lost for words, his face flushing a deep red. Beside him, Olenna Tyrell's sharp eyes widened for a fraction of a second before her legendary political instincts took over. She realized the sheer magnitude of the offer. The Reach would control the crown's finances. Olenna sharply nudged her son in the ribs with her elbow. She leaned in, her voice a harsh, urgent whisper meant only for him. Accept it before he changes his mind, you absolute oaf. Mace blinked rapidly, recovering his wits. He puffed out his chest, attempting to project an aura of dignified statesmanship. I would be deeply honored, Lord Stark. House Tyrell will serve the crown faithfully. I accept the position. Robert looked at the bumbling Lord of Highgarden, then back to Ned. He didn't particularly like Mace Tyrell, but if the wolf wanted him counting the coppers, Robert wouldn't argue. Then Mace Tyrell is the Master of Coin, Robert confirmed gruffly. See that the treasury is rebuilt, Tyrell. Baelish left us a mess. I will personally review the ledgers, Your Grace, Mace promised eagerly. There is one final matter regarding the council, Ned said, holding up a hand to stall further conversation. The current structure of the small council was designed for peacetime administration and court politics. It is insufficient for what is to come. I propose a new position be created, the Master of War. The lords exchanged confused, wary glances. The Master of War will be solely responsible for the logistics, strategy, and deployment of the Crown's armies, Ned explained. This position will be crucial not only during the Long Night, but for any future conflicts the realm may face. The man who holds this seat must deal with everything related to warfare, supply lines, defensive fortifications, and troop movements. Ned looked past Lord Hoster Tully, focusing on the veteran knight sitting beside him. I propose Ser Brynden Tully for the position, Ned declared. Brynden the Blackfish. Tully raised his eyebrows in genuine surprise. He was a seasoned battlefield commander, a man who preferred the grit of an army camp to the perfumed halls of a castle. He had never sought political power. Hoster Tully looked at his estranged brother, a sudden flush of immense pride warming his pale face. Robert Baratheon's eyes lit up with immediate approval. The king despised the bureaucratic nonsense of his council, but a master of war? That was a position he understood perfectly. Having a hardened veteran like the Blackfish coordinating the armies sounded like the best idea he had heard in 15 years. A master of war? Robert repeated, a fierce grin breaking through his heavy beard. Finally, a seat that actually matters. I create the position, and I appoint Brynden Tully to fill it. Will you take the duty, Blackfish? Brynden Tully stood up from his chair. He gave a crisp, deeply respectful bow to the king, and then to Ned. I am a soldier, your grace, not a politician. But if it is the defense of the realm you require, you have my sword and my mind. I thank you, and I accept the appointment. As Brynden retook his seat, a heavy silence fell over the room once more. The great lords of Westeros sat frozen, their minds struggling to process the sheer velocity of what had just occurred. In the span of an hour, Eddard Stark had completely reshaped the ruling power of the continent. He had not asked for their opinions. He had not opened the floor to debate or political bartering. He had simply dictated the new order of the world, and the king had stamped every single decision without a moment of hesitation. The absolute, unquestioned alliance between the stag and the wolf was a terrifying force to behold. For our next topic, Ned continued, seamlessly moving past the stunned silence of his peers, we must address the matter of the Crown Prince. The tension in the room spiked instantly. To speak of the heir to the Iron Throne was always dangerous territory, especially with the boy's grandfather sitting mere feet away. We all saw Prince Joffrey in the Great Hall this morning, Ned stated clearly. He did not raise his voice, nor did he sound mocking. He spoke with clinical, detached observation. We saw his display when confronted with the living dead. We do not need to delve into the embarrassing details of what happened on that floor. But the reality is clear. Ned looked directly at King Robert. The boy is entirely smothered by the Queen, Ned said bluntly. He is surrounded by velvet and sycophants. That environment is not good for a young man, and it is fatal for a future king who must eventually lead this realm through the aftermath of the long night. Robert scowled, his hands clenching into fists on the table. He knew the truth of Ned's words. He despised how Cersei coddled the boy, raising him to be an arrogant, sniveling prince rather than a hardened warrior. Ned shifted his gaze to the Lord of Casterly Rock. Lord Tywin, Ned said, his voice respectful but commanding. I ask if you are willing to take Crown Prince Joffrey under your personal care, to take him to Casterly Rock as your ward, and educate him on how to be a strong, capable ruler. Tywin Lannister's stoic facade cracked for the very first time that evening. His pale green eyes widened fractionally. We all know your capabilities, Ned continued, ensuring the entire room heard the praise. We know how you single-handedly restored the prosperity and power of House Lannister after the failings of your father. You are arguably the most effective administrator in the Seven Kingdoms. No man in this room can question your competence when it comes to instilling discipline and educating a future king. The political brilliance of the maneuver hit the room like a physical shockwave. Olenna Tyrell let out a soft, barely audible hum of appreciation. Oberyn Martell raised an eyebrow, genuinely impressed by the wolf's cunning. By sending Joffrey to Casterly Rock, Ned was completely separating the Crown Prince from Cersei's toxic influence. He was removing the boy from the volatile, dangerous environment of King's Landing. But he was doing so by wrapping the exile in an immense compliment to Tywin Lannister's pride, turning a punishment into a supreme honor. Tywin's mind raced. He had secretly despaired at how Cersei was raising the boy, seeing the same arrogant madness that had plagued Aerys Targaryen beginning to take root in his grandson. Having exclusive control over the Crown Prince's education would allow Tywin to break the boy of his mother's bad habits and mold him into a true, pragmatic Lannister king. Tywin Lannister gave a slow, deeply respectful nod. You honor me, Lord Stark, Tywin said, his voice smooth and controlled, though a genuine note of satisfaction lay beneath it. He looked toward the head of the table. If His Grace is willing to send the boy to Casterly Rock, I will personally see to his education. I will ensure he becomes a man worthy of the throne he stands to inherit. Tywin paused, his gaze shifting to Robert with a cold, preemptive calculation. However, Your Grace, if this wardship is to be successful, the Queen's presence would only hinder the boy's progress. For the duration of his education, I ask that Queen Cersei be forbidden from leaving the Red Keep to follow us to the Rock. Discipline cannot be instilled while a mother's indulgence whispers in the other ear. Robert Baratheon didn't even pause to consider it. The thought of getting Joffrey's constant whining out of the Red Keep and keeping Cersei far away from the boy's development sounded like a gift from the gods. Done, Robert declared with a firm, heavy nod. The boy leaves for Casterly Rock at the end of the week. Cersei stays here. Let the mountain air and your strict hand harden him. Tywin. Lord knows I haven't been able to. Jaime Lannister looked down at the table, his mind elsewhere. He knew his sister would scream until the Red Keep shook when she heard the news. Cersei would view it as a kidnapping. But as Jaime looked at his father's calculating eyes and the king's absolute resolve, he knew there was nothing Cersei could do to stop it. The boy was gone. Ned then turned his gaze toward Renly Baratheon. The Master of Laws had spent most of the meeting looking pale. Lord Renly, Ned said, his voice drawing the young man's attention. Most of the City Watch is currently in Peter Baelish's pocket. They have been fed on bribes and corruption for years. Janos Slynt is a butcher's son who has sold the safety of this city to the highest bidder. Renly blinked, straightening in his chair. It is better if you make the necessary changes immediately, Ned instructed. Secure the gold cloaks. Ensure they serve the crown and no one else. We cannot afford to have the capital's guards compromised when the dead are at our gates and the small folk are panicked. Renly, sensing the weight of the task and the lack of choice in the matter, gave a quick, solemn nod. I understand, Lord Stark. I will see to the watch at once. Near the heavy oak doors, Ser Barristan Selmy stood as a silent sentinel. The legendary Lord Commander of the Kingsguard watched the proceedings with a stoic, unreadable expression. He had served kings for decades, through the madness of Aerys and the early years of Robert's drinking. He had seen the Red Keep as a place of endless, suffocating intrigue. But as he looked at Eddard Stark sitting beside the king, Barristan realized he was witnessing something he hadn't seen since the days of the old king. The North had not just arrived in King's Landing. It had conquered it without a single drop of innocent blood. The politics, the whispers, and the games had been swept aside by the sheer, unyielding pragmatism of the wolf. For the first time in many years, Barristan felt a flicker of true hope for the realm. The Red Keep finally belonged to men of honor again. Ned Stark leaned back in his chair, his gray eyes sweeping over the silent, completely restructured council. The board had been entirely reset. The dead were marching, but the realm of the living had finally found its teeth. Chapter 129, Plans for the Future. The heavy scent of metallic blood still lingered in the air of the small council chamber, a grim reminder of the price paid for treason. The shattered glass and crimson stains on the polished oak table marked the definitive end of an era of whispers and shadows. Ned Stark sat back in his heavy wooden chair, his gray eyes sweeping over the newly appointed council. The board had been cleared of rats and spiders, but the vacuum of power was quickly being filled by the crushing weight of the reality they now faced. The schemers have been removed from the board, Ned said quietly, his voice carrying a calm, unyielding finality. He looked at the faces of the men who now held the survival of the realm in their hands. Now, since all the positions are filled, let me tell you all what we should focus on next. The great lords of Westeros leaned forward. The fear of the long night still gripped their hearts, but the swift, brutal restructuring of the council had given them a sense of grim purpose. The long night is our primary enemy, Ned began, his voice steady and echoing off the stone walls. The dead are gathering in the deep woods, and the cold is creeping south. But the living still pose a danger that could cripple our supply lines and burn our fields before the first snowflake ever hits the ground in the Riverlands. King Robert Baratheon crossed his massive arms over his chest, the wood of his chair groaning under the weight. The king's blue eyes sharpened, the familiar hunger for battle rising to the surface. Is it the Targaryen boy across the water? Robert asked, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. It is more than just the boy, Robert, Ned replied, his tone entirely pragmatic, devoid of any dramatic flair. My men in Essos have sent a confirmed report. Khal Drogo, along with his entire Khalasar, is currently preparing to cross the Narrow Sea. They are intending to attack the Seven Kingdoms in force. The room erupted into a sudden, chaotic chorus of hushed, hurried voices. The sheer magnitude of the threat broke the disciplined silence of the council. Mace Tyrell, the newly appointed Master of Coin, grew exceptionally pale, a sheen of sweat breaking out across his broad forehead. Dothraki? Here? But they fear the poison water. They have never crossed the sea in all of recorded history. Why now? Why us? Tywin Lannister did not panic. The Lord of Casterly Rock steepled his fingers beneath his chin, his pale green eyes narrowing as he calculated the threat. Thousands of screamers. They will need lots of ships to transport that many men, let alone the horses. That requires a fleet larger than the free cities possess combined. Currently, Volonté is preparing ships for the Dothraki to sail, Ned answered smoothly. And the reason they are sailing is because of Viserys Targaryen. Ned looked around the table, ensuring he had the undivided attention of every lord present. Viserys Targaryen attempted to sell his sister, Daenerys, to Khal Drogo, Ned explained, the blunt truth laying bare the desperation of the exiled prince. The girl was the price for the Khal's army. The deal was struck. The feasts were held in Pentos under the roof of Magister Illyrio, and the exchange was prepared. Oberyn Martell leaned forward, his dark eyes intense. And? Did the Khal take the girl? He did not, Ned stated. Because the day before the deal could be finalized, Daenerys Targaryen vanished. The lords exchanged confused, wary glances. Vanished, Jon Arryn repeated, his aged brow furrowing. A princess does not simply disappear from a heavily guarded manse in the middle of a free city. She is nowhere to be seen, and no one in Essos knows where she has gone or who took her, Ned confirmed. But Viserys Targaryen, in his desperation to keep the Khal's army, pointed his finger directly across the sea at the Iron Throne. Robert let out a harsh, barking laugh. He blamed us? He thinks I sent men across the water to steal a girl I wanted dead anyway. He convinced the Khal that the usurper's dogs kidnapped his bride to insult the Dothraki and deny them their prize, Ned said. Khal Drogo is a warlord who rules by strength and fear. His pride is everything. Hearing that the lords of Westeros reached across the sea to steal his property and mock his power broke that pride. He is enraged. He has vowed to tear down our stone houses and trample our lands into dust. Stannis Baratheon's jaw ground audibly. A war started over a missing girl and a madman's lie. How long do we have until they sail? Lord Yohn Royce asked, his thick hands resting flat on the table, the bronze runes on his armor catching the firelight. The making of the ships will take time, Ned answered, his gaze sweeping over the map laid out before them. In 4 moons, they will be setting sail for the eastern shores of Westeros. The room fell into a tense, calculating silence as the lords debated the reality of the threat. 40,000 light cavalry, completely unarmored but possessing a savagery unparalleled in the known world, unleashed upon the continent while the North braced for the dead. If they land in the Crownlands or the Stormlands, they will pillage the countryside, Mace Tyrell fretted, dabbing his brow with a silk handkerchief. They will burn the crops we are desperately trying to harvest for the winter. We cannot feed the North if our fields are reduced to ash. They fight without armor and wield curved blades that cannot pierce plate steel, Tywin Lannister observed coldly. They are a nuisance in an open field against disciplined infantry, but a nuisance we cannot afford right now. The realm's strength must be focused on the wall, not chasing horse lords through the riverlands. Then we do not let them reach the fields, Brynden Tully interjected. The new master of war stood up from his chair. The Blackfish walked over to the large map of the continent, tapping a calloused finger against the blue expanse of the narrow sea. The Dothraki are masters of the open plains, Brynden stated, his veteran eyes scanning the faces of the council. Put them on a horse with a bow, and they are deadly. But put them on the wooden deck of a rolling ship, and they are completely useless. They fear the sea. They do not know how to swim, and they do not know how to fight on water. Robert Baratheon's eyes gleamed with sudden understanding. A fierce, predatory grin spread across his face beneath his heavy beard. You want to sink them before they ever see the coast. Exactly, Your Grace, Brynden confirmed, his voice hard as iron. We do not wait on the beaches. We meet them in the deep water. Ned nodded approvingly. Lord Brynden, as Master of War, you will formulate the strategy of the blockade. I will need every warship we possess, Brynden detailed, his mind already calculating the naval tactics. Lord Tyrell, you will send word to the Arbor. Paxter Redwine is to sail his fleet around the southern coast and bring his galleys into the narrow sea. But strategy requires a commander on the water. Lord Stannis smashed the Iron Fleet at Fair Isle. I recommend he command the vanguard of this blockade. Stannis Baratheon sat rigidly, his expression unchanging, though a flicker of martial pride touched his eyes. I will take the command. I know the currents of the stepstones and the gullet. We will form a wall of wood they cannot break. Lord Tyrell, Ned said, shifting his gaze to the master of coin. A blockade of this size requires vast amounts of pitch, arrows, and provisions. You will open the treasury immediately. I want funds flowing to the shipwrights by tomorrow morning. There will be no delays. Mace Tyrell puffed his chest out, eager to prove his worth in his new seat. The gold will flow, Lord Stark. House Tyrell will ensure the royal fleet lacks for nothing. Earlier, I mentioned Peter Baelish's stolen gold. The 2 million dragons are stored in an underground vault beneath his primary brothel on the Street of Silk. I shall have the gold cloaks secure the building at once, Lord Stark. What of the Myrish puzzle lock you mentioned? Do not waste time trying to solve it, Ned commanded bluntly. Take a contingent of stonemasons and men with heavy sledges. Break the walls of the vault down entirely. Retrieve every last dragon and deposit the gold directly into the royal treasury. It will be done. And what of Magister Illyrio? Robert growled, his massive hands gripping the armrests. He hosted the Beggar King and brokered this invasion. I want his head. You will have to take it from Khal Drogo, Ned replied practically. When the girl vanished, Drogo chose to believe the lie about Westeros, but a Khal does not forgive a broken deal. He did not grant the Magister or the Beggar King the mercy of a quick death. He holds them both responsible for the insult. Viserys Targaryen and Magister Illyrio are now his slaves. Robert's heavy brow furrowed in grim satisfaction. Slaves. Our men report they are now slaves in Drogo-Khalsur, Ned confirmed. They will be dragged across the narrow sea to witness the Khal's vengeance. They are no longer royalty or wealthy magisters. They are the lowest of Drogo's thralls. Ned then brought the council's attention firmly back to the primary, overarching threat. The sea will deal with the Dothraki, but our true enemy does not sail in ships. They march on foot, and they bring the cold with them. We must prepare the anvil. Ned turned his gaze to Tywin Lannister, Mace Tyrell, and Yohn Royce. Every Lord Paramount is to immediately send trusted men, cargo barges, and sturdy wagons to Dragonstone, Ned commanded. He then turned to Jon Arryn. Send a raven to the royal castellan at Dragonstone. He is to open the deepest vaults and organize the docks. When the barges arrive from the other kingdoms, I do not want a crush of ships clogging the harbor. The loading of the Black Rock must be swift and orderly. The raven will fly tonight, Jon confirmed. Once you have taken your share of the dragonglass, carry it directly back to your strongholds, Ned continued. Empty your forges of luxury goods and ornamental steel. Have your smiths work day and night. We need spearheads, daggers, and arrowheads. Tens of thousands of them. It will be done, Lord Stark, Yohn Royce agreed, his voice echoing in the chamber. Arming your standing armies is only the first step, Ned stated, his gray eyes sweeping over the table. You will return to your kingdoms, and you will ensure that everyone within your borders receives instruction in arms. Everyone, Lord Stark? Mace Tyrell asked, blinking. The small folk. Every man, woman, and youth old enough to hold a piece of wood, Ned clarified, leaving no room for debate. Send your master-at-arms into the villages. Give them simple practice. Teach them how to hold a spear and brace the shaft against the ground. They do not need to be master swordsmen. They simply need to know how to thrust dragonglass into rotting flesh. Lord Renly, Brynden Tully interjected, looking at the young master of laws. While the fleet meets the Dothraki, we cannot leave the coast bare. You will reinforce the shoreline keeps. Prepare a safe retreat for the small folk of the Stormlands and Crownlands, pulling them inland. If a few Dothraki ships slip past the blockade, we will not leave our people on the beaches to be slaughtered. Renly Baratheon swallowed hard, his earlier arrogance entirely gone, replaced by the heavy burden of duty. I will map the paths of retreat, Lord Brynden. Ned then turned away from the southern lords and looked directly at the hand of the king. Jon, Ned said, his voice lowering slightly. There is one last weapon we must secure. The wildfire casks. Where are they stored? A visible shudder passed through the older men in the room. Tywin Lannister's jaw locked tight, remembering the day he sacked the city, entirely unaware he was walking on top of a dormant volcano of emerald flame. They are stored in a safe location, Jon answered, his voice quiet. Deep, reinforced stone vaults well outside the city walls. They are guarded by the Alchemists' Guild. I want them moved, Ned ordered. I want every single cask carried to the wall. Jon Arryn's eyes widened in genuine alarm. Moved? Ned, the substance is incredibly treacherous. A sudden shift in the heat or a broken will could ignite a traveling pyre. Fire is the enemy of the dead, Jon, Ned countered, his voice steady. And that green fire is the most potent weapon we possess. It must be done carefully. Use the most experienced handlers, suspend the jars in damp sand, and travel at a walking pace. Ned leaned forward slightly. And do not trust the pyromancers entirely. Assign a heavy guard of utterly loyal Valemen to watch the alchemists day and night. Ensure no acolyte tries to skim or mishandle the substance during the journey. If the wall is besieged by a force we cannot hold back with steel alone, Ned said to the room. We will fill the ice trenches with it. We will create a sea of emerald flame at the base of the wall that not even the ancient cold can extinguish. It is our ultimate defensive line. Jon Arryn let out a long, heavy sigh, the burden of the order settling heavily on his frail shoulders. I will meet with the wisdoms tonight. The wagons will roll under the cover of darkness and heavy guard. Ned gave a single, firm nod. Then our tasks are set, Ned declared. He stood up from his heavy wooden chair. King Robert stood with him, followed immediately by Jon Arryn, Tywin Lannister, and the rest of the small council. The heavy scrape of wood against stone echoed as the most powerful men in Westeros rose as one united front. When the battle with Drogo is finished, Ned said, looking directly at Robert across the polished oak. I expect you at the wall, your grace. The realm needs its king on the front lines. The north will be the anvil, but the crown must be the hammer. Robert Baratheon gripped Ned's forearm, his grip firm and full of a renewed, fierce energy. I told you I would ride with you, Ned, Robert promised, a dangerous, joyful anticipation in his voice. I will crush these horse lords in the water first, and when the sea is quiet again, I will bring my hammer to your wall. Robert let out a harsh, booming laugh that finally sounded genuine. We'll show these ice ghosts that the stag and the wolf still know how to hunt in the dark. The king turned to the gathered lords. The council is adjourned. See to your duties. If I find any man slacking while the dead march and the Dothraki sail, I'll take his head myself. With unified purpose, the lords of Westeros turned and marched toward the heavy oak doors. There was no lingering to whisper in the corners, no plotting in the shadows. They moved with the hurried, disciplined steps of men who had a continent to prepare for war. As the lords filed out into the corridors, King Robert clapped a heavy, calloused hand firmly onto Ned's shoulder. Come on, Ned, Robert grunted, the heavy weight of the crown temporarily lifting from his brow. My head is pounding from all this talk of ledgers and provisions. I need a proper drink, and you owe me a cup of that northern fire. Ned offered a faint, tired smile. Just one, Robert. We have an early ride tomorrow. Together, the king and the warden of the north turned away from the empty council chamber, their heavy boots echoing in tandem as they walked down the dim stone corridor toward the king's private solar. The great game was over. The true war had finally begun. Chapter 130 Aftermath. The heavy oak doors of the small council chamber had barely closed before the tremors of the meeting began to shake the foundations of the Red Keep. For 15 years, the capital had operated on a steady diet of whispers, bribes, and polite deceptions. In a single evening, the Warden of the North had taken a warhammer to that fragile peace, reducing the greatest players of the game to blood and ruin. In the opulent, crimson-draped chambers claimed by House Lannister, the air was thick with a stunned, suffocating silence. Tywin Lannister stood by the roaring hearth, his hands clasped firmly behind his back. Jaime leaned against the heavy stone frame of the window, his green eyes staring out into the dark night, though his mind was still replaying the sickening crunch of Peter Baelish's fingers. Kevan Lannister and Tyrion had been waiting in the chambers when they returned. As Tywin and Jaime relayed the grim truths of the meeting, the younger Lannister men listened in absolute disbelief. 3 seats, Kevan murmured, his voice laced with shock. He paced a slow circle around the center table. The Master of Coin, the Master of Whisperers, and the Grand Maester, all stripped of their positions and thrown into the black cells in the span of an hour. The king allowed this. The king did not merely allow it, Uncle, Jaime said, a smirk playing on his lips. He agreed to it. Robert sat back and let his northern brother play the executioner. Varys had his face smashed into the wood. Baelish lost every finger on his hands, and Pycelle wept like a beaten dog. Tyrion took a long, slow swallow from his goblet of wine, his mismatched eyes wide. I always knew the spider and the mockingbird were playing a dangerous game, but for the wolf to simply walk in and crush them both, I must admit I underestimated Eddard Stark. I thought him a man bound by honor, not a butcher of the court. Honor does not mean a lack of ruthlessness, Tyrion, Tywin stated, his voice a cold, commanding rumble that demanded the room's attention. He turned from the fire, his pale green eyes sweeping over his family. Eddard Stark acted with the absolute authority of the Iron Throne. He exposed treason, theft, and a Blackfire plot that would have bled this realm dry. He was not playing the Game of Thrones. He was clearing the battlefield. Tywin looked directly at his youngest son. And he has left the treasury in the hands of the Reach. Mace Tyrell is the new master of coin. Tyrion raised an eyebrow. The Lord of Highgarden? The man cannot count his own toes without his mother's assistance. Why hand him the purse? Tywin says. He did not give Mace Tyrell the purse out of need. He did it to ensure every kingdom holds a seat on the council, trapping them in a cage of shared responsibility. He gave Highgarden the burden of ensuring money is taken care of during the war, just as he gave Master of Whisperers to Martells, and Master of War to Tullis and Dashdot. The heavy wooden door to the chambers suddenly swung open. Queen Cersei swept into the room, her emerald eyes flashing with an anxious energy. She wore a gown of rich crimson silk, but the usual haughty arrogance of her posture was strained. She had heard the whispers in the corridors. The city watch was marching on Baelish's brothels, and Kingsguard knights were dragging screaming men to the dungeons. What has happened? Cersei demanded, looking between her father and her brothers. The keep is in an uproar. My servants say that Stark attacked the council. Robert must have him arrested. No one is arresting the Warden of the North, Tywin said coldly. He has saved this kingdom from rotting from the inside out. Cersei stopped in her tracks, staring at her father as if he had spoken in tongues. He brought a monster into the throne room. He terrified the crown prince. Which brings us to the next matter, Tywin said, his voice hardening into a tone that brooked no argument. The crown prince will be leaving King's Landing by the end of the week. Joffrey is coming with me to Casterly Rock. The color drained entirely from Cersei's face. She stood frozen for a fraction of a second before the shock curdled into pure, blind fury. What? Cersei hissed, her voice trembling. No, no, he is my son. He is the future king. He belongs here in the capital by my side. He is a sniveling coward who soiled himself in front of the entire realm, Tywin countered, his words striking like physical blows. He embarrassed our house, and he embarrassed the crown. He was startled by a demon, Cersei shrieked, entirely losing her composure. She stepped toward her father, her hands balled into tight fists. You cannot take him. Robert is a drunk, and Stark is a savage. They are trying to steal my son to weaken me. Silence! Tywin roared, his voice cracking like a whip. The sheer force of the old lion's anger filled the room, instantly suffocating Cersei's fit of rage. She flinched, stepping back instinctively. Tywin closed the distance between them, towering over his daughter. His pale eyes were chips of flint, devoid of any paternal warmth. You have raised a weak, arrogant boy who hides behind the white cloaks of his guards, Tywin said, his voice dropping to a lethal, quiet pitch. When the long night falls, the men of Westeros will not follow a boy who weeps at the sight of blood. The Starks and the Baratheons are united. They hold the North, the Riverlands, the Vale, and the Stormlands. Our gold means nothing if the dead breach the wall. Lannister gold cannot buy survival. Cersei breathed heavily, tears of sheer frustration welling in her eyes, but she did not dare interrupt. Lord Stark offered me the wardship of the Crown Prince, Tywin continued mercilessly. He recognized that if Joffrey remains under your indulgent wing, he will die a weakling. He is going to Casterly Rock. He will learn the weight of a sword. He will learn the harsh realities of rule. And you will remain here in the capital, entirely forbidden from following us. The king has commanded it. Robert commanded it? Cersei spat, her face twisting with venom. Robert does whatever his northern dog tells him to do. Then you should be thankful the northern dog had the sense to give the boy to his grandfather, Jaime said quietly from the window. Cersei whipped her head around, glaring at her twin with absolute betrayal. You agree with this? I agree that the world is ending, Cersei, Jaime replied, his green eyes somber and serious. I saw the dead man. If Joffrey stays here, wrapped in silk and shielded from the truth, he will not survive the winter. Father is the only one who can harden him now. Cersei looked around the room, finding no allies. Kevan stood firmly with Tywin. Tyrion was staring intently into his wine cup, wisely keeping his mouth shut. Jaime had taken their father's side. You are a fool, father, Cersei whispered bitterly, her voice trembling with barely contained rage. You think you are securing his future, but you are letting the wolves tear our family apart. I am saving our legacy, Tywin corrected coldly. Go to your chambers, Cersei. Pack the boys' trunks. He rides for the Westerlands in 5 days. Cersei cast one final, hateful glare at the men of her family before turning on her heel and storming out of the room, the heavy wooden door slamming violently behind her. Tywin did not even flinch at the noise. He turned back to Kevan. Send the ravens to the deep mines tonight, Tywin ordered, his mind instantly returning to the coming war. We must begin pulling the black rock from the earth before the week is out. Across the Red Keep, in the grand pavilion erected for House Tyrell, the atmosphere was a turbulent mix of immense pride and creeping anxiety. Mace Tyrell paced the length of the rich Myrish carpets, his chest puffed out, a wide, foolish grin plastered across his face. Master of coin, Mace declared to the room, clapping his hands together. A Tyrell on the small council. The king himself placed the treasury in my hands. The entire wealth of the 7 kingdoms, managed by Highgarden. Loras Tyrell sat on a padded bench, still looking pale and thoroughly shaken by the morning's horrors in the great hall. The prospect of gold did little to chase away the memory of the blue-eyed corpse. Garland stood near his brother, his hand resting on the pommel of his sword, his expression far more grounded than his father's. At the head of the long dining table sat Olenna Tyrell. The Queen of Thorns was sipping a cup of strong, spiced wine, watching her son's display with a look of deeply ingrained exhaustion. Marjorie sat beside her grandmother, her sharp brown eyes taking in the shifting currents of her family. Oh, do sit down, Mace, before you wear a hole in the carpet, Olenna snapped, setting her cup down with a sharp clack. You look like a prized rooster strutting before the slaughter. Mace stopped pacing, looking deeply offended. Mother, this is a great victory for our house. The Starks have recognized our true worth. Lord Stark practically handed me the position. He did not hand you the position out of respect for your brilliance, you absolute oaf, Olenna said, her voice dripping with sharp, biting reality. He handed you the position because he is making sure every kingdom is chained to the council. He gave you the purse so that Highgarden is forced to fund the realm's armies while they fight the ghosts in the snow. Marjorie leaned forward slightly. Lord Stark played a very deep game tonight. Did he not, grandmother? He played the only game that matters, my sweet. Olenna agreed, a rare note of genuine respect in her tone. He walked into a room filled with the most dangerous men in the capital, and he broke them over his knee without drawing a blade. The spider, the mockingbird, the Grand Maester, all gone. He bound every great house to a task so that no one has the freedom to plot in the shadows. He commanded me to break into Baelish's hidden vault, Mace boasted, trying to regain his footing. 2 million golden dragons. I will lead the gold cloaks myself to tear the walls down. You will do no such thing, Olenna commanded sharply. You will send your captains to do the heavy lifting, and you will ensure every single copper is accounted for. If Eddard Stark finds out you kept so much as a silver stag for yourself, he will cut your fingers with a wine goblet just as he did to Baelish. Mace swallowed hard, the memory of the wet, sickening crunch in the council chamber suddenly cooling his enthusiasm. The Knights of the Reach are not meant for fighting in the deep snows, Garland spoke up, his voice steady. If the dead march, our heavy horse will be useless. What is our part in this war, grandmother? Our part is to feed the southern anvil, Olenna stated firmly. The north can feed itself, but the Stormlands and the Riverlands will march, and they will need bread. We will keep the realm's armies fresh and our silos full. If the realm survives this long night, the crown will owe its very existence to the harvests of Highgarden. Olenna looked at Marjorie. The days of tourneys and silken dresses are over, child. We are farmers now. The survival of our house depends on how well we tend the fields. In the chambers assigned to the lords of the Riverlands, the mood was solemn, but an undercurrent of fierce, brotherly pride warmed the stone walls. Lord Hoster Tully sat in a comfortable chair near the fire. The Lord of Riverrun was sick, his body failing him, but the fire in his eyes burned brighter than it had in years. Across from him stood his brother, Brynden the Blackfish. Master of War, Hoster murmured, a raspy chuckle escaping his chest. He coughed into a linen cloth, then looked up at his brother. They finally found a use for your stubbornness, Brynden. Brynden crossed his arms, leaning against the heavy stone mantle. It is not a title for a courtier, Hoster. It is a terrible burden. The Dothraki are preparing to sail, and the dead are marching on the wall. The king expects me to marshal the defense of the entire realm. And there is no man better suited for the task, Hoster said firmly. You have fought in the Stepstones. You fought in the Ninepenny Kings. You know the Narrow Sea and you know how to break an enemy host. Ned Stark chose wisely. Ned Stark has become a terrifying man, Brynden noted quietly. He did not simply ask for my naming. He commanded the room. He told the king what was needed, and Robert agreed without a second thought. The wolves have taken the Iron Throne, Hoster. Not with swords, but with sheer, undeniable necessity. I must leave for Dragonstone soon, along with Stannis. We need to organize the royal fleet before the Dothraki even finish loading their horses. The Narrow Sea must become a wall of wood. Brynden paused, his brow furrowing with sudden realization. But the Riverlands cannot be left without a field commander while I am at sea or counseling in the capital. I will send a raven to Edmure tonight. He must assume full command of the river lords in my absence. He is young and eager for glory, Hoster warned softly. He needs to stop playing at tourneys and learn to hold a true line, Brynden replied sternly. I will order him to begin drilling the men immediately and to fortify Riverrun's walls. We cannot afford mistakes. Protect the Riverlands, Brynden, Hoster said softly, his illness making his voice weak. When the fighting starts, our lands are always the ones that burn. Ensure the supply lines from the Reach are guarded. I will secure the King's Road, Brynden promised, placing a strong hand on his brother's frail shoulder. The grain will flow north, and the Riverlands will hold. High in the Tower of the Hand, the fires burned low. Jon Arryn sat alone at his heavy writing desk. The aged hand of the king looked thoroughly exhausted, the deep lines on his face carved by the weight of 15 years of blind trust and the crushing betrayal he had witnessed that evening. He dipped a fresh quill into a pot of black ink. He unrolled a thick piece of royal parchment, stamped with the seal of the Iron Throne. He began to write, his handwriting sharp and deliberate. To the conclave of archmesters at the citadel of Oldtown, by the decree of King Robert Baratheon, first of his name, the position of Grand Maester of the Seven Kingdoms has been vacated. Pycelle has been stripped of his chain for crimes of treason and the breaking of his sacred vows. Jon paused, the quill hovering over the parchment. He thought of the quiet, terrifying authority of the Northern Warden. He thought of the walking corpse in the Great Hall. The realm did not need another soft, whispering politician in a gray robe. It needed a man who understood the dark. The Iron Throne requires a replacement immediately, Jon wrote, pressing the quill firmly into the paper. You are hereby commanded to send Maester Marwyn to the capital to assume the seat. He is the only candidate the crown will accept. If the conclave refuses to send Marwyn, or attempts to send another in his place, do not bother sending anyone at all. The crown will view it as a defiance of the king's will. Jon signed his name, Jon Arryn, Hand of the King, and reached for the hot wax. As he pressed the heavy iron seal of the hand into the red wax, Jon felt a strange sense of closure. His era of governing through compromise and polite smiles was dead. Eddard Stark had dragged the realm into the harsh light of reality. Jon handed the sealed letter to a waiting scribe. Take this to the rookery immediately. Have it sent to Oldtown by the fastest raven we possess. The scribe bowed quickly and hurried from the room. Jon Arryn leaned back in his chair, staring out the window toward the dark expanse of the north. The board was reset. The traitors were in chains. It was time to brace for the storm. Deep within the luxurious guest quarters, the scent of Dornish incense and rich wine filled the air. Prince Oberyn Martell pushed the heavy wooden door shut, sealing himself and Ellaria Sand inside their private chambers. The Red Viper did not look weary. He looked absolutely invigorated, a dangerous, thrilling light dancing in his dark eyes. Ellaria, lounging on the edge of the wide featherbed in a robe of sheer yellow silk, sat up. She saw the restless energy rolling off her lover. The council meeting is over, Ellaria observed. pouring 2 cups of strong Dornish red. Did the wolf and the stag bore you to tears with talk of grain and taxes? Oberyn let out a sharp, genuine laugh. He walked over, took the wine cup from her hand, and drained it in a single swallow. Bore me, Oberyn repeated, his smile wide and lethal. Illyria, my son, I have just witnessed the greatest, most brutal slaughter in the history of the Red Keep, and not a single sword was drawn. Illyria raised a dark eyebrow, her interest piqued. What happened? Oberyn began to pace the room, his hands moving animatedly as he recounted the sheer chaos of the evening. Eddard Stark walked into that room and broke the entire court, Oberyn said, his voice thrumming with excitement. Petyr Baelish, the master of coin? Stark pinned his hand to the table and cut his fingers with a wine goblet. Exposed him for stealing millions and funding the zealots. Illyria gasped softly, her eyes widening. The little mockingbird? Ruined, Oberyn confirmed gleefully. And the spider. Stark took Varys by the back of the head and shattered his face against the oak table. Exposed him as a Blackfyre loyalist trying to bleed the realm for an invading army. Even the old Grand Maester was thrown into the black cells for spying for the queen. Oberyn stopped pacing, turning to look at Illyria. 3 seats, emptied and filled in an hour. Stark bound every great house. He gave the treasury to the Tyrells to fund the war. He gave the armies to the Blackfish. And he gave Dorne the master of whisperers. Illyria stood up, walking slowly toward him. Doran. Doran, Oberyn confirmed with a nod. Though I will sit in the chair and speak in his stead until the snows come. And then there is Dothraki. And what of the Dothraki? Illyria asked, wrapping her arms around his waist. Oberyn's tone grew slightly more serious, though the thrill of the fight still lingered in his eyes. Said, Viserys angered the Khal, and the Khal is bringing his horde to our shores in 4 moons. But the Starks and the Baratheons are not going to let them land. We are going to sink them in the narrow sea. Oberyn pulled Illyria closer, his hands resting on the small of her back. But the greatest victory of the night did not belong to the crown. It belonged to me, simply by sitting in the room and watching. What did the wolf do? Illyria whispered. He forced Tywin Lannister to take the crown prince away from his mother, Oberyn said, a dark, vindictive satisfaction dripping from every word. Stark framed it as an honor, but he ripped the boy from Cersei's arms and ordered him to Casterly Rock. The old lion had to agree, and he even forbade his own daughter from following them. The golden lions are eating each other, Illyria. Lannister gold means nothing in the face of the long winter. Illyria smiled, a slow, wicked curve of her lips. She traced a finger down Oberyn's chest. The world is ending, the dead are walking, and the horse lords are sailing. But tonight, our enemies bleed. Exactly, Oberyn murmured, leaning down to kiss her deeply. The war will come soon enough. But tonight, we celebrate the fall of the spiders and the rats. Oberyn pulled away slightly, his dark eyes gleaming. Get dressed, my love. We are going to the Street of Silk. Illyria raised an eyebrow. To a brothel? On a night like this? Not just any brothel. Oberyn laughed, his voice rich with anticipation. Lord Stark commanded Mace Tyrell to tear down Petyr Baelish's primary pleasure house tonight. The Mockingbird apparently hid 2 million golden dragons in the walls. I intend to sit across the street with a skin of excellent wine and watch the gold cloaks smash the little thief's legacy to absolute rubble. I want to drink to the health of the Warden of the North while the dust settles. Far away from the chaos of the packing lords and the marching city watch, the king's private solar was a haven of quiet warmth. The roaring hearth cast long, dancing shadows across the thick Myrish carpets. King Robert Baratheon and Eddard Stark sat opposite each other in heavy leather chairs. Between them, resting on a low oak table, sat a simple iron flask of northern fire. They had not spoken a word for the better part of an hour. Robert took a slow, heavy swallow from his cup, letting the potent spirit burn its way down his throat. The crown of the 7 kingdoms sat discarded on a side table, looking like a forgotten trinket. Ned held his own iron cup, his gray eyes fixed entirely on the dancing flames. The fierce rush of the council, the swift, ruthless breaking of the capital's great players. It was all fading, leaving behind only the cold, crushing reality of what lay ahead. The realm is yours to command, Ned, Robert murmured, the booming volume of his voice entirely gone, replaced by a quiet, grounded exhaustion. The gold is seized. The fleets are gathering. The glass is being mined. Ned took a slow sip of the harsh spirit. It is a start, Robert. Only a start. A sword is useless if the arm holding it is not strong. Robert gave a single, slow nod, staring into the fire. He looked at his calloused hands, remembering the weight of his warhammer and the bloody mud of the trident. You sail at first light. At first light, Ned agreed. They fell back into silence. Two old soldiers sitting in the quiet calm before the greatest storm the world had ever seen, bracing themselves for the long road north.